All right. Welcome, everybody, to Stronger Weekly. I'm your host, Jesse Karajat. Thank you so much for being here this week, which happens to be the last week of October. So for everybody out there that did Sober October, you got less than a week left. Good for you. Keep on keeping on. For those that didn't, that's okay. If you're drinking, you can always choose to do it another time. That said, for this week's episode, I have Corey Turner joining the show. If you don't know who Corey is a licensed professional counselor and licensed addiction counselor. She's out here in Northern Colorado, and she specializes in, I'll say, all things addiction, but she has a specific expertise around alcohol use disorder. I thought it'd be great coming out of October to have a professional come on the show and talk about what is addiction? How do you know if you are addicted to something? What is alcohol use disorder? What is it not? And most importantly, if you think you may have a problem or a challenge with any substance or any addiction, what can you do about it? What are your options? So hang on for that one. But before we jump into the health and fitness headlines, I wanted to share my thought or topic of the week. And for this week, it's actually cardiovascular training. Okay, if there's a category that I get asked the most questions about, whether it's listeners of the show or people in my life, it's about cardiovascular training. And look, these days, right, I'll be 41 in just about a month. When I think about all training, right, strength training and cardiovascular training, I look at it through the lens of health span. And that said, strength training is absolutely pivotal, right? If you're not already strength training and you can, you need to be. And I encourage anyone that isn't to go back into, the 2 years of doing this podcast. And there are plenty of great episodes about strength training, why it matters, how it helps, how to do it, etc. So with that said, we're not going to talk about strength training, but what I wanted to talk about this week is how do you, or how should you, layer cardiovascular training over your strength training so that you have a well-rounded training protocol that helps you not just look good and feel good, but live longer and healthier. Okay. And that said, there are primarily two different forms of cardiovascular training that I think and I recommend everyone should be doing. So one is zone 2 cardio, and then the other is high intensity interval training. And so let's start with zone 2 cardio. So this is your easy, steady state cardio, the type of cardio that as you're doing it, you can hold a conversation, even though you might be struggling a little bit, and your heart rate stays roughly between 60 to 70% of your max heart rate. And you can sustain that for 30 to 60 minutes. Now for zone 2, I try to focus on 3 different sessions to get about 90 minutes per week. Why? Because the research is overwhelming. Okay, so first, zone 2 builds what's called your aerobic base, meaning your heart becomes more efficient at pumping blood and your cells become more efficient at using oxygen. Why does that matter? That translates into better fat metabolism, which we all want, faster recovery between sets, meaning there's a crossover benefit to your strength training. You'll be able to recover faster, a lower resting heart rate, which is an indicator of overall health and health span, and a stronger, more flexible heart. We all want a strong heart that is efficient and a flexible one that can adapt based on the demands that you're putting on it to function, whether that's in daily life or in your training. Okay. 3 sessions, about 30 minutes each session. And I'll get into how I actually program those in a minute. Now let's talk about the other one, which is high intensity interval training. I do about 20 to 30 minutes of high intensity work per week. And what I'm looking for is improvements in what's called VO2 max. VO2 max is your body's maximum capacity to use oxygen during intense exercise. And VO2 max is emerging as the most important indicator of overall health span. Meaning if you have a high VO2 max, it is more likely for you to live longer and healthier in your life. And it's far surpassing some of the other markers that you can use if you're tracking your fitness. According to Harvard Health and the American Heart Association, right, two important bodies of research, a higher VO2 max means lower risk of cardiovascular disease, Alzheimer's, and early mortality, even more predictive than cholesterol or blood pressure. Now, just for a point of reference for you all, my current VO2 max is 52. That's the number for me, which, according to Harvard Health data, puts me in the excellent range for men around 40 years old. And I have to be honest, that surprises me because I don't focus on cardio. I don't invest as much weekly time in cardio as I do in my strength training, about 5 hours per week in strength training and 2 hours in cardio. And I'm not training for, some crazy race, and I'm not pushing myself to the brink, and I'm not being so intentional to train my VO2 max. So I'm surprised that I'm basically in the top 5% for my age, sometimes top 3, depending on if I'm running more or leaning into that. And because I don't focus on it and I have those benefits anyway, I thought I would share exactly what I do because I don't spend hours every single week doing it. So let's talk about how I layer in that 2 hours over my strength training so I can get all those benefits, but not be killing myself and over investing time every single week. So to revisit my strength training protocols right now, I'm practicing what's called an upper, lower, push, pull, legs. That's how I structure my strength training workouts. That's 5 days. And I do the upper and lower on Monday and Tuesday. On Wednesday is a dedicated zone 2 cardio day. And then I start the push, pull, legs on Thursday, Friday, Saturday. And then I take off on Sunday. That's my Sabbath from fitness and basically all things. So what I do is I take those 3 zone 2 cardio sessions. I put them on Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. Okay. Now on Monday, I do 30 minutes after my strength training. On Wednesday, it's a dedicated day. I really beat up my lower body on Tuesdays. So on Wednesdays, I just do an incline treadmill walk for first thing in the morning. I set that thing at 4 miles per hour and 10% incline. Good to go. That's what gets me there. And then on Friday, as I mentioned, that's when I do another 30-minute session, and that's after I strength train. Now, the one thing I'll mention is that normally on Mondays, now we're going to kind of move over into the high intensity training side of things. On Mondays, I'll do what's called a fartlek run if I'm running. All right. Now, a fartlek run is a great tool for VO2 max training. Look it up, Fartlek, fartlek run, and there's different ways you can do it. But essentially, any way you do it, it boils down to the same thing. You have a period where you're doing max or near max effort. Some people just say just run hard, for example, if you're running. And then you have another period where you back off. And then you repeat that for a certain amount of repetitions. My exact fartlek run looks like this: 5-minute easy jog. As soon as you hit 5 minutes, 3 minutes of a hard run. And that's subjectively hard to you. 3 minutes, sustain it, and then 2 minutes of an easy run. And then rinse and repeat 5 times. So again, 5-minute jog, 3 minutes hard, 2 minutes easy, 3-minute hard, 2-minute easy, 3, 2, 3, 2, 3, 2, and then a 5-minute jog, slow down. That's called a fartlek run. I found that my heart rate gets way up in zone 5 by that second interval. And when I do fartlek runs consistently and track my VO2 max, I see a huge increase, assuming I'm sleeping good, strength training, I'm eating good, all those things. I found that if I'm doing a fartlek run, a lot of times I'm getting zone 2 cardio that same day. Point there is back to the high intensity side of the house. That is counted as one higher intensity session for me. Again, getting that heart rate up to performing when I'm demanding a lot of it, which you don't normally see with zone 2. The other high intensity day that I have is on Saturdays. That's my lower day, my second lower strength training day. And what I'll do is I'll usually choose 3 compound movements for my lower body. And when those are done, I do a functional training session. That's just more like movement patterns where they're more athletic, more explosive. And I'll just mix it up every single week, which I love. But I always do a very demanding movement as the centerpiece of that 15 to 20 minute functional training session at the end of my strength training. So that could be things like if you have an assault bike, brutal. If you have a box or a box jump, you could do burpee box jump overs is a great one. You can do actual sprints, right? Go out, sprint for 30 seconds, jog for 30 seconds, walk for 30, and repeat. You could do a 20-second sprint and just rest for 40 seconds, whatever. But something that is mentally and physically challenging. And I'll choose a duration, usually for me, 12, 14, 20 minutes, where I'm positive I'll get my heart rate way up into that zone 5 that I want to see. And that is how I do my HIIT. So it's twice a week. One's a fartlek run earlier in the week. And then later on the week on a Saturday, I do a functional training session. And that's really how you tie it all together, right? So again, you should be strength training. You should find a window to do zone 2 and try to get at least 90 minutes per week. And at least once a week, if not twice, you should be focusing on more of a high intensity session to get your heart rate up to improve your VO2 max. And if you do those things, right, you can be sure that you will be strengthening your heart, making it more flexible. You'll be focusing on fat loss. You will look good. You will feel good. And then hopefully long term, you will live longer. And that's how I focus my cardiovascular training. So hopefully that was helpful. Hopefully there's some good takeaways for you there. And now, as always, we are going to jump into our health and fitness headlines of the week. Your first health and fitness headline of the week. Big news on alcohol and heart health this week. New study finding that even light drinking raises blood pressure. So a new analysis published in Hypertension Research found that even light to moderate drinking, as little as 1 drink per day, can raise blood pressure over time, contradicting old studies suggesting low-level drinking was heart protective. We all remember that. A glass of wine a night, 2 glasses, seems to no longer be the case. So researchers reviewed 19 studies involving more than 360,000 participants, finding that systolic blood pressure increased for every additional daily drink consumed. Dr. Marco Vincetti of the University of Modena said, quote, "There appears to be no threshold for harm. Even moderate drinking carries measurable risk," end quote. This adds to growing evidence that alcohol raises cardiovascular risk through inflammation and oxidative stress, not just calorie load. So, healthiest approach to alcohol is occasional mindful use, no more than 1 to 2 drinks per week, ideally separated by alcohol-free days. So 1 to 2 drinks per week. I know that could be a big step for some people, but hopefully the takeaway here is just to be mindful that the alcohol consumption, and more research is coming out. It's so bad for our organs, our heart, our liver. It's so bad for our stress levels, our sleep. If you wear a heart rate tracker and you happen to track sleep, have a couple drinks, wake up and take a look at it, because it can be pretty shocking. But more and more coming out here about the detrimental effects of alcohol on the body. Next up, new research finding that brisk walking daily is linked to a longer life. By now, I think we should all know this, but steps matter, folks. So new research in the British Journal of Sports Medicine found that walking just 7,000 to 9,000 steps per day can significantly reduce all-cause mortality. And most of the benefits occur well below the popular 10,000 step mark. So the study analyzed data from 111,000 adults across 4 countries and found that people who consistently walked at a brisk pace, over 100 steps per minute, if you're wondering, lived longer and had fewer cardiovascular deaths, even if total daily steps were modest. So in other words, it's not the amount of steps, it could be how fast you're walking. So lead author Dr. Amanda Pulak explained, quote, "Pace matters as much as volume. Walking faster appears to reflect better cardiovascular fitness and overall resilience," end quote. So if you are sedentary, aim to start at around 7,000 steps per day and focus on speed, not just total duration. And also, as a side note, whenever possible, walk outdoors. Sunlight exposure and time in nature amplify the metabolic and mental health benefits. So get out, walk around, monitor your steps. If you're getting near the end of the day and you're not quite there, go for a walk after dinner, walk around the house, whatever it is. But more and more research coming out just linking overall steps and activity to longer, healthier lives. Your next health and fitness headline, new one here, finding that nearly 1 in 5 urinary tract infections are linked to contaminated meat. Didn't see that one coming. So, a shocking new study from George Washington University's Milken Institute of Public Health estimates that 18%, so almost 1 in 5, of UTIs, again, that's urinary tract infections in the United States, can be traced to E. coli bacteria found in contaminated meat products, particularly chicken and turkey. Researchers tested over 1,500 samples from supermarkets across 10 states and genetically matched the bacteria to UTI strains infecting humans. Dr. Lance Price said, quote, "For decades, we've underestimated the food-borne route of these infections. This study shows it's a major, major contributor," end quote. The report found that retail poultry labeled as store brand or sourced from large industrial producers had the highest contamination rates. So we all want to save some money these days. But when you go to Walmart and you see the Walmart brand right next to something else that said it's organically raised, organically made, you might want to invest in that because it's your body. And the last thing you need is a UTI, which is painful and expensive. Next up, a new study finds that when it comes to fitness, you should not judge a book by its cover. So a new paper from the University of Copenhagen, published in Nature Metabolism, challenges the idea that if we look fit, we must be fit. So the study tracked over 60,000 adults and found that individuals who appeared healthy externally had obesity-like issues and markers such as abnormal blood lipids, higher liver fat, and pre-diabetic glucose levels, even when individuals are physically active. So lead researcher Dr. Stig Bjorsen said, quote, "You can't always judge metabolic health by appearance. Many people with normal blood pressure or cholesterol are already developing, and this is key, silent organ damage. So don't assume you're healthy just because you look good." And what it comes down to is make sure you get your labs checked annually. Look for things like fasting glucose, triglycerides. Waist circumference does matter, but there could be other things going on. So folks, do not assume you're healthy just because you feel and look it. Make sure, especially as you age, you are getting your blood work done because you might get ahead of some issues that you could be facing downstream that could cut your life earlier. And your last health and fitness headline, last and certainly the least, thought I'd end on a lighter kind of note here. This one has to do with what's called butt breathing. If you haven't heard of it, now you have. Researchers at Nagoya University in Japan say that oxygen absorption through the rectum could one day help people with severe lung conditions breathe more easily. So apparently scientists in Japan are pretty bored out there, putting tubes in places they shouldn't go and coming up with some pretty wild stuff. So keep an eye on those Japanese scientists. But in all seriousness, published in Biomaterials Advances, the team tested oxygen-rich liquid enemas on animals and found improved oxygen levels and survival during respiratory distress. Lead researcher Dr. Takanori Takibi said, quote, "It's unconventional." He's right. "But our data suggests this method could offer emergency oxygenation when ventilators aren't available. While not ready yet for hospitals, the study opens an entirely new route, I'll say, for respiratory therapy." Literally opens up a new route. So folks, what this means is, and in all seriousness, they found this breakthrough where, let's just say you're admitted into the hospital and for whatever reason you have a damaged windpipe and it's difficult to intubate if there's not a respirator available, they are finding that they could literally put oxygen, basically liquenated oxygen, in your rear, and that could give your body and your organs the oxygen it needs to survive. So interesting breakthrough there. These scientists are always coming up with more things to help us live, and I'm grateful for that. But all right, folks, I digress. I hope that was helpful. Always tune into Stronger Weekly. We're always doing a little curation of all the health and fitness news out there for you so you can stay ahead and stay healthy and stronger every single week. Just a quick word from our sponsor, and then Corey Turner joins us on the other side. We'll see you over there. Look, 1 in 10 Americans today struggle with alcohol use disorder, and I was one of them. Did you know that there is a safe, science-backed daily pill that you can take to drink less or even quit alcohol for good? It's called naltrexone, a doctor-prescribed medication that you get online, and our sponsor, Or Health, is the nation's leading provider of naltrexone. To date, Or Health has helped over 35,000 1,000 people find freedom from alcohol, and I'm proudly one of them. To get started, text STRENGTH to 710-710. Again, that's STRENGTH to 710-710, and get started on your journey to finally find freedom from alcohol. I'm here with Corey Turner. Corey, how are you?
Great. How are you?
I'm doing good. Thanks for being here. As you can tell, it's different for us this episode. Normally virtual remote. Corey happens to be in Northern Colorado. She is a licensed professional counselor and licensed addiction counselor. We're going to get into what that is and the different ways that folks who are needing help or treatment can get that help with folks such as Corey. So what is addiction in a medical way or maybe in even a conversational way?
Yeah, clinically, when I use the word addiction, what I'm referring to is a chronic brain disease in which the reward pathway in our brain gets hijacked from the consistent use of drugs and alcohol. So I am referring more to that medical model of our understanding of addiction. I know socially and culturally, the word addiction gets thrown out a lot, maybe in ways that aren't appropriate or accurate. So saying that I have like a Starbucks addiction, I think it can be thrown out and sometimes muddy the waters in terms of what that means and
maybe
what we associate with that. Yeah. So I'm using it in a clinical sense that we understand it as kind of a disease and that disease model of what's happening in the brain and how that affects our emotions, our behaviors, our relationships.
Yeah, and you used the word chronic. Say more about that.
Yeah, we see that once a dependence develops on a substance for some of the chemicals that we need in our brain, without treatment or without some effort to address it, becomes a chronic pattern.
Chronic means continuous, but not necessarily forever? Or is it?
It can be reversed
Yeah.
and addressed, and without any effort to do so, I would expect it to continue.
I'm going to go down the digital addiction route. But would you classify digital addiction as like a major problem today up there with substances, or are they kind of separate in the way that you talk about them clinically?
Well, we do have a kind of separate set of addictions called process addictions, which are more behaviorally related. So this would include things like disordered eating, sex addiction, things like that. So these are other ways, other behaviors that interact with our reward pathway. And we know that a lot of our technology is designed to kind of hijack that same system. So I would say it's certainly part of our behavioral addictions. I'm not necessarily a specialist in behavioral addictions, but process addictions, but I think that's an undeniable concern.
Yeah. So we have process addictions, substance abuse addictions. I'm sure maybe there's some other types or not, but
those are those are the ones that we have diagnoses for.
Okay. And talking about the brain, are similar mechanisms at work? Are similar things happening on both sides of those?
Yes.
Yeah. Can you talk a little bit about what's happening in the brain?
So what happens is, well, let me start by saying that dopamine is probably the single most important neurotransmitter involved. Again, it's much more complicated than this, but I'm going to simplify it for the purposes of the conversation. So dopamine is the chemical in our brain that gives us a sense of pleasure. It's what motivates us to do things. So what happens in the brain is there's certain behaviors, in this case also substances, alcohol, that interact with our reward pathway. So the reward pathway is what releases dopamine into our system. We get dopamine in other places too, but that's the primary way that we get dopamine released. So that part of our brain exists to cause us to repeat behaviors that we need to keep surviving. So I need to keep eating. I need to keep procreating.
Surviving. Okay.
So this is tapping into a pretty primal part of our brain. Just so happens that substances cause our brain to release lots of dopamine. And what happens is we initially get an exponentially larger release of dopamine in our brain than what we would normally have. And so that's what feels really good initially. But then what happens is that causes us to be in a dopamine deficient state. So we get a really big dopamine release, but then over time, that release is smaller and smaller and smaller until it's actually a fraction of what we would normally have without substance use. So how that affects our behaviors is without enough dopamine, we can't get out of bed. We can't do those things that are really important to us. So that's why we see with people who have a long-term substance use disorder or addiction is that it's hard for them to even function. And it's because they're in this chronic dopamine deficient state.
Now, is that because the normal way, quote unquote normal, but the everyday way absent from substances, or was it called control addictions? I'm sorry, was that the other type?
Process.
Thank you. Is that because the dopamine release is so much lower, smaller, whatever you would say, that when you introduce this foreign substance that just spikes it up, your body is responding less and less to those natural dopamine releases and it becomes reliant on the more intense ones?
That's right. So then we don't get enough pleasure and reward from the things that are essential to our survival, which is why we see folks kind of disengaging from relationships, not taking care of themselves. It's not necessarily a conscious choice that they're making. It's just that they're not getting the dopamine that they need from those experiences to continue repeating those patterns.
Wow. Well, and so essentially your life revolves around that substance, because that's especially if survival is underneath, that's a powerful motivator.
Yeah. So what happens is we start with that initial intoxication that can become a pattern. And then what happens is when you stop using, you're in a withdrawal state that can affect your emotions and behaviors really negatively. And that increases cravings. And so then you enter into this anticipation and preoccupation with substances. So you're in this pattern of intoxication, withdrawal, and then preoccupation. But that doesn't mean that somebody's going to stay stuck forever. It does mean that it's going to be really difficult to start to heal the brain. So there's going to be a lot of really difficult decisions to make. That's why we see that folks tend to need a lot of support in that process. Maybe they need medical treatment or medications initially to kind of stabilize some of those things.
Look, life can be hard and stressful sometimes. We all know that. But when it comes to supplements, why is it that nobody talks about stress and resilience? For me, I take the adaptogen stack from Momentous Supplements. It's a daily blend of ashwagandha, rhodiola, and L-theanine, all clinically backed to help you stay calm, focused, and resilient. I'm proudly partnered with Momentous Supplements because they are the industry's best. They don't cut corners. Everything's third-party tested, used by pro athletes, and high quality. Head to livemomentous.com and use code STRENGTH for 35% off your first order. Again, that's livemomentous.com, code word STRENGTH for 35% off your first order, and get started today. When you think about addictions, what has changed? Has anything changed? Are you seeing more or less prominence of certain types of addictions? And just kind of culturally, as a society, what have you seen, and even where do you see us heading?
Yeah, it's a great question. Unfortunately, the rates of addiction are increasing fairly significantly. These are complex issues. I'm sure there's lots of socio-political, biopsychosocial factors that impact all of these things. I think we've all gone through some shared experiences that can be traumatic for people. So that might increase some of the rates. There's been changes in substances themselves that have made a more recent impact. So in the opiate crisis that we're in, just with there's these synthetic analogs. That's what fentanyl is. And we've heard fentanyl a lot.
Yeah. Analog?
It's a synthetic analog. So the chemical structure is just a little bit different. An analog is just one kind of change in the chemical structure, but that change affects the body in really unpredictable ways. And so with these synthetic drugs, it's just not as predictable. So some of our treatments aren't as effective. So that's certainly something that's changed specific to opiates, but in a larger sense, there's just been an increase in things like loneliness, depression, and anxiety. People tend to go to drugs and alcohol to cope with difficult or intolerable emotions. And
We'll turn the corner. We'll start talking about alcohol. So I think it's good to just start with, what is alcohol use disorder?
so alcohol use disorder is a clinical diagnostic term that we use to diagnose and treat alcohol addiction.
Okay.
So it's clinical language, and we're referring to a specific set of symptoms that may indicate to us that somebody has developed an emotional or a physical dependence on alcohol. We tend to use alcohol use disorder and alcohol addiction kind of interchangeably. And previously, some of the diagnostic terms included things like alcohol abuse. And you'll even notice some of our big government projects still have words like alcoholic in them. However, that word specifically is more related to some of the history with Alcoholics Anonymous, and I'll kind of talk about that. So when we're looking at the differences between like a clinical approach to treatment and more of a social peer approach, one thing is that clinically, we're using that medical disease model to understand addiction and to help inform some of our treatment recommendations.
Mm-hmm.
So we use the understanding that we have now about the brain to help us maybe recommend certain treatments. So we're using a medical model, we're using person-first language, so we intentionally avoid using a term such as alcoholic, and we may say somebody with an alcohol use disorder or somebody with alcohol addiction. The history of alcohol treatment actually started with AA. So previously, the model that was kind of embraced by everybody to understand addiction was a moral model. So we perceived addiction as like a moral failing. It was a character flaw, something kind of wrong with that person.
Mm-hmm.
And we've evolved our understanding over time. And because that's where we started, people had a hard time getting the help that they needed from professionals. There was a lot of shame that came from that, and so not a lot of professional treatment was available, if any, in the beginning. And that's actually how AA developed, was a group of people who wanted to help each other because they weren't getting professional help, and they developed a program to support each other in recovering.
Mm.
So the roots of both are in that moral model. And I will say that the medical disease model is being embraced clinically right now. There is a lot to be said for the social support that you get in a mutual aid support group like AA or other groups. And I'll say that you can get support professionally too. Those boundaries are just going to look different, and people may have a preference for one or the other. The person sitting across from me is more than their alcohol use disorder, and I think that using a label can be reductionistic in terms of only seeing that part of them. I also have heard from people that it can become important to them to identify as that, to have that as part of their identity. So when we look at some of the recovery research, not everybody who resolves a drug or alcohol problem identifies as like being in recovery. It's just not part of their identity. But we do tend to see that with like the more severe an addiction that somebody has, the more likely they are to kind of integrate that into part of their identity. So for some people, that is important to them.
One of the things that prohibited me from getting help earlier in my journey, because I knew alcohol had a grip on me, was my loose understanding of the permanence of the label. I don't know if I didn't want to, I refused to, but something about that didn't stick. I have agency in my life. I can control outcomes in my life. It takes effort, discipline, hard work, those things. And I didn't like this notion that for me to get out of where I was, there was no getting out, no matter what I did. And so that, all of that to say, I can see if anyone has ever been turned off by that one notion of AA, I can relate with that. When we think about alcohol use disorder, So now we've moved towards a mild, moderate, severe. So the question I should be asking myself, I guess, then is, am I on that spectrum?
Mm-hmm.
And if so, where?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Okay. Tracking. And then the question is versus the permanence model of AA. Can I move on the spectrum and potentially not be on the spectrum? Or is that too black and white to think about it?
I think that actually is the gray area. The black and white would be, I either have this or I don't, and I'm either going to get better or I'm not. The truth is in the middle. So we can see human behavior right on a spectrum. And when we're asking ourselves, is this a problem for me? Well, I think that would be the first question. Is this a problem for me?
Yeah.
Like, is this causing some kind of negative impact in some area of my life? That's actually our first criteria when we're doing a diagnosis.
If you were sitting with me, that's
yes, there has to be some kind of negative impact in your life from this. So that could be getting arrested for a DUI, or it could be I, am losing relationships because I'm not paying attention to them, or I'm acting impulsively or doing things I wouldn't normally do in a state of intoxication. So it has to be affecting your life negatively in some way. And then we have a list of 11 different symptoms, and you actually only have to have 2 of those to qualify for an alcohol use disorder.
Okay.
So I think that threshold is actually lower than what people would expect, but it's also not this black and white thing of I'm either an alcoholic or there's no problem at all. I think there's also something to be said for understanding, we call it the risky levels of use. So even if we take a diagnosis off the table, because some people have really strong negative feelings about that, they feel like a diagnosis is a label too. Even if we just look at risky drinking, for women, that's 4 or more drinks in one setting, or more than 7 or 8 in a week. I think that's probably a lot lower than what people would assume, or maybe that's just, maybe it was less than what I thought it would be.
8 in a week as a red flag is concerned, that would be less
for
than
women.
I would assume. Yeah.
So even if we just look at, are there risks with my use? Even if I don't feel like there's some huge negative impact in my life, is there risk with my current level of use? And the data would show, if you fall in that range, that yes, there's at least going to be some kind of risk to your health.
What would be like a second or maybe even a third question that you would ask?
I would probably ask what you want to be different about that. I think that's the benefit of kind of working with a professional, is that they're trained to kind of guide you and following your own goals and values to make a change plan, because you're more likely to follow through with that if you're clear on those things. So what about your current use? Do you want to be different? And kind of exploring that. So it could be cutting back and being in that less risky use. So maybe I just do a trial of managing or moderating my use to having less than 4 drinks a week. Or maybe I want to do a trial period of abstinence and just see how that goes. Just see, how do I feel differently when I don't use alcohol at all? Do things get better or worse? And then I kind of have that proof for myself of, what looks different when I make this change.
Where do you see the treatment of alcohol use disorder going in the future? You foreshadowed earlier that there's some tools or there's some things that we're using to kind of combat it, but like, where do you see it going? What's next? And talk us through that.
I think there's some really interesting things that I've heard in conferences and in research. So interestingly enough, I think there is some work being done using psychedelic assisted therapy. That's a whole rabbit hole too. It seems like there's more about that coming out. There's lots of trials that have been wrapping up over the past couple of years. So I expect that we're going to continue to see more about that. Without getting into all the reasons why, I think there is a lot of funding for research on medications. So I'm sure we'll continue to see different medications come out. And regardless of maybe your stance on medications, there's undeniable value if there's something that can keep somebody from dying. So sounds like there's some work being done on things that might work towards that. So medications are always something that, gets a lot of attention and funding. So I'm sure we'll see more there too. There's also just a lot that we still don't fully understand about the brain. And as we come to learn more, that helps us to inform our kind of treatment approaches and options. So I'm looking forward to what comes out of that as well.
If I was listening, I would be asking myself that question of, I guess, how I would phrase it internally, what I would actually probably literally Google would be
Hmm.
in the privacy of my home. Do I have a drinking problem? That's what I would probably Google. I don't know that I would know the terminology, but if someone is still kind of like listening and thinking through that, how would you advise them to answer that question? And then what would a next step be?
Yeah. I do have a biased opinion, and that I think talking to a professional can be really helpful because we are kind of an unbiased, as in we don't have a personal investment in your life and your outcomes necessarily. And so we can give some of that feedback and even just maybe even reflect things back to you so that you can hear them in a different way.
Mhm.
And that can help somebody get clarity or even just learn kind of what change options might look like. That being said, if that's not accessible to you or you're not interested in that option, I think you can always approach change with just a sense of curiosity and say, I'm going to try some things and see what seems like it helps the most.
Mhm.
So, as I mentioned, maybe I just cut back or set some limits for myself and see if that feels more manageable. Maybe I do that trial period of abstinence and just see how I feel differently and see what else changes in my life. You could work with a coach or even just invest your time and energy in some things that you know are good for you and see if kind of balancing the scales gives you the result that you're looking for.
If you could say one or two or three things to anyone listening that, again, is exploring this whole topic of addiction, maybe alcohol abuse, but if you could say one thing or get through one point, what would it be?
I think the biggest takeaway for me would be you don't have to identify as an alcoholic to decide to change something about your relationship with alcohol. And you don't even have to commit to any one change in order to maybe find ways to better manage your well being, your emotions, your relationships. So I think doing our best to keep an open mind and knowing that there's all kinds of pathways and options to healing and recovery. And that might include professional things, it might include social things. You might not ever talk to another person about it. There's lots of different options. I do believe that knowledge is power. So if somebody even just wants to look at some of the research around alcohol or other substances and decide for themselves if it's something that's posing a risk to them, I would say the best place for a lot of that information are some of our kind of big government sites. So I'm going to preface this by saying that they have outdated language in their name because these really big groups, it's very hard to change your name. So one is the NIAAA, the National Institute on Alcohol Abuse and Alcoholism.
Which we've learned those are.
Yes, I know.
Okay.
So this is through the NIH, but they have a lot of information about different treatments, about kind of the effects of alcohol, prevalence rates. It's just a good place for data. And the other option would be for alcohol specifically, there's something called SBIRT, Screening and Brief Intervention.
And we'll link to everything in the episode notes. But say that
Yeah.
again, Espert?
SBIRT.
What is
And
that?
so this is like a screening and initial kind of brief intervention tool for alcohol use. And this is sponsored through SAMHSA, Substance Abuse and Mental Health Service Administration. So they have some guidelines on there about risky drinking and what is a drink. So they define what a drink is and what the levels are for low risk and high risk drinking. And so that would just be a good place to start to get informed yourself about kind of what's going on. And maybe that will help you decide what option to explore first.
Awesome. Okay. And we'll get all those details from you and we will link to them. Corey, anything else you want to share with listeners?
No, I don't think so. I'm super excited to talk about this, and I appreciate you creating the space for it.
Thank you for taking the time to be here. Thank you. Corey Turner, everybody. Well, that's it for this week's episode. Thanks for listening to the Stronger Weekly podcast for your health news, fitness insights, and motivation. Wishing you a strong and healthy week ahead. We'll see you next time.